The buzzing of chainsaws woke me up at 6:30 in the damn morning. I shot out of bed, heart hammering, because that sound was coming from my backyard, and I sure as hell didn't hire anyone. I threw on jeans, grabbed my phone, and bolted outside, and there she was. Pamela Brooks, the HOA vice president and full-time menace to society, standing with two guys in neon vests as they sliced clean through my 12-foot-tall privacy hedge. The hedge I spent 5 years growing. The hedge that shielded me from the street, the HOA clubhouse, and most importantly her. "Pamela," I yelled, storming across the yard. "What the hell are you doing?" She turned around, sunglasses perched on her nose like she was some kind of celebrity. "Mr. Zayden Holt," she said, voice dripping with condescension, "your hedge was in violation of HOA Code 7.2b. It exceeded the 6-foot height limit. That's a guideline, not a law," I snapped. "And even if it wasn't, you can't just show up and cut down someone's property without notice." "I gave notice," she said, flipping through a clipboard. "I mailed you a notice 2 weeks ago." I folded my arms. "You mailed it. Pamela, I live here. You walk by my house every single day with your little clipboard. You couldn't knock on my door." She didn't answer. One of the workers dragged a massive branch across my lawn like it was trash. That hedge wasn't just a green barrier, it was my peace and quiet. It was the one thing keeping Pamela and her HOA cronies from peeking into my yard every time I grilled a steak or sat on my deck with a beer. "You had no right," I said, my voice low now. "This is trespassing, destruction of private property." Pamela actually laughed. "You can take it up with the board if you like, but we're just enforcing the rules. We have photos, timestamps, and records. Good luck." And then she walked off, just like that. No apology, no shame, left my yard a wreck, left me boiling. That was the moment I decided I'd had enough. No more playing nice. No more letting the HOA push me around. If Pamela wanted to see what enforcement looked like, I'd show her. The concrete wall idea hit me that night. If they had a problem with the height of my hedge, what were they going to do about an actual 12-foot wall? I spent 2 days reading local ordinances. Turns out, there was no height restriction on decorative privacy structures if they were set 3 feet in from the property line and didn't obstruct public sidewalks. So I got to work. I didn't just hire a contractor, I hired a crew that specialized in high-end privacy features. I told them, make it tall, make it smooth, and make it look like Fort Knox. Within a week, footings were poured. Pamela came by during the 2nd day of construction, arms crossed and burning with curiosity. "What is this?" she asked, eyes wide. I tapped the blueprint with my finger. "A privacy feature, Pamela, decorative, within city code." "And unlike you, I got permits." She looked like she swallowed a lemon. "You can't be serious," she said. "This looks like a prison wall," I grinned. "Yeah, that's the point." The wall was halfway up by the end of the week, and the neighborhood buzzed like a stirred hornet's nest. I caught glimpses of residents slowing down in their cars when they passed my lot. Some nodded in approval. Others, likely Pamela's inner circle, frowned like I'd built a gallows in the front yard. The crew worked fast, laying block and smoothing concrete with the kind of precision that made it clear this wasn't some fly-by-night job. This was deliberate, legal, and permanent. On Saturday morning, I was in the driveway unloading a shipment of cedar panels for the interior side of the wall when a silver SUV screeched to a halt in front of my house. Out stepped Gerald Langston, the HOA president. The man had the gait of someone used to being obeyed and the expression of someone who just realized the world didn't revolve around him. "You and I need to talk," he said, walking straight up without so much as a greeting. I dropped the tailgate. "Then talk. You're creating a visual disturbance," he said, gesturing at the wall. "This structure is affecting community aesthetics. Several residents have filed complaints." "Then they can come talk to me themselves," I replied. "I'm here on behalf of the board." "No, you're here because Pamela got her ego bruised," I said, stepping around him, "and because you didn't expect someone to push back." Gerald's face tightened. "This is not about Pamela." This is about maintaining the architectural harmony of the neighborhood. I pulled out a folder from the cab of my truck and handed it to him. City permits, surveyor's report, and a letter from a zoning lawyer confirming it meets every local requirement. Want me to staple it to the wall for easier reading? He opened it, flipped through a few pages, then closed it slowly. You've made your point, but don't think this is over. I don't, I said, walking past him. I think it's just getting started. By Tuesday, the wall was finished. 12 feet high, smooth as glass on the exterior, with a warm cedar lining on the inside that made my backyard feel like a private retreat. I installed motion detecting floodlights along the top, solar-powered and angled to avoid shining into anyone else's property. Everything buttoned up clean and lawful. That night I sat on my deck with a beer, finally enjoying the silence, until I heard the crunch of footsteps in gravel behind the wall. I stood, walked to the corner, and peeked through a narrow vent slit. A flashlight beam danced across the base of the structure on the outside. 2 figures, both in dark clothing, were inspecting the foundation. One had a clipboard, the other was taking photos. I hit the record button on my camera app and leaned into the mic. "Can I help you with something?" They froze. Then bolted. I sprinted through the house, out the front door, and caught a glimpse of them ducking into a side yard 2 houses down. I didn't chase them. I didn't need to. The next morning, I reviewed the footage. Clear images of both people, Pamela and a board member I recognized from a past neighborhood meeting. I emailed it to my lawyer with the subject line, "Trespass after dark surveillance." By Friday, I had a motion-activated camera system installed at every corner of the wall. 4 different angles, all feeding to a cloud server. My lawyer drafted a cease and desist letter to the HOA, citing unauthorized inspections of private property, and a formal complaint was filed with the City Code Enforcement Office. But Pamela wasn't done. That weekend, a notice appeared taped to my front door. A fine over $3,000 for unauthorized visual obstruction, nuisance lighting, and failure to submit renovation plans to the HOA Architectural Committee. I took the paper straight to my neighbor, Darlene, a retired municipal code inspector who knew the county regulations like the back of her hand. She sat at her kitchen table, glasses low on her nose, reading line by line. "This is fabricated," she said flatly. "None of these violations exist, and even if they did, the HOA can't enforce them retroactively. That's illegal." I nodded. "Thought so." "Can you help me draft a response?" She leaned back, linked her fingers behind her head. "We can do better than that." That Monday, Darlene and I showed up at the next HOA board meeting. I brought a folder. She brought a binder. The room was packed, at least 30 residents, many of whom had never attended a meeting before. Word had spread. Pamela sat at the front with Gerald and 3 other board members. When she saw me walk in, her mouth tightened. She clearly hadn't expected me to show up armed with backup. When the floor opened for comments, I stood. "I'm here to address the fine issued against my property," I said. "I have documentation proving the wall was built in full compliance with local zoning, permitting, and safety codes. I also have footage of 2 board members trespassing on my property at night without notice or consent and conducting what appears to be an inspection." I placed a stack of printed stills on the table. Pamela leaned forward. "There has been widespread concern about the impact. I'm not finished," I said. "I've also filed formal complaints with the city's code enforcement and submitted a cease and desist letter regarding continued harassment. Furthermore, my neighbor Darlene, a retired code inspector, has reviewed the HOA's fine notice and identified at least 5 violations of both HOA bylaws and state law. Would you like her to read them?" The room shifted. A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. Gerald cleared his throat. "This is not the appropriate forum for legal disputes." "It absolutely is," Darlene said, standing. "Your board members illegally entered private property, you fabricated violations, and your actions are not only unethical, they're criminal." Pamela stood abruptly. We were conducting an after-hours assessment due to safety concerns. So you admit you were there, I said. She hesitated. Yes, but it was necessary. Then explain this, I said, and handed over a printed email from the city zoning department. There were no safety concerns reported. In fact, your board never filed any official complaint with the city, which makes your little investigation not only unauthorized but baseless. A man in the back raised his hand. Is this why our HOA fees went up last month? Because the board's hiring lawyers to fight neighbors over fences. That opened the floodgates. One woman demanded to know why her garden shed application had been denied 3 times. Another guy brought up Pamela's nephew, who'd mysteriously landed the clubhouse landscaping contract despite 0 experience. Voices overlapped. Gerald tried to gavel the room into silence, but it was no use. I leaned over the table and looked Gerald dead in the eye. You want to come after me? Fine, but this board better be ready for what's coming next, because I'm not just defending myself anymore. I'm filing to audit the HOA's financials. I'm requesting a full review of board conduct for the past 3 years. And I'm calling a special election to remove every one of you. Pamela's face drained of color. Gerald looked like he'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes. I've already gathered the signatures, I added. The petition goes to the county clerk in 48 hours. The room broke into applause. Not polite clapping full on applause. Even the board members who hadn't spoken all night looked rattled. On my way out, a few neighbors stopped me. One offered to help with the election paperwork. Another, a former paralegal, said she'd start digging into the HOA's contracts and budget. Pamela didn't say a word as I passed her, but her eyes followed me all the way to the door. If she thought the wall was the end of it, she had no idea what was coming next. By the following Monday, the petition had been submitted to the county clerk's office with more than double the required signatures. The special election was officially on the calendar, set for 6 weeks out. And just like that, the board's grip on the neighborhood began to unravel. I didn't wait for the election to start gathering ammunition. With Darlene's help, I filed a public records request for the HOA's financials. Turns out, while Pamela and Gerald had been wagging their rulebooks at homeowners, they'd quietly been funneling thousands of dollars into administrative expenses with 0-line item detail. Over the last 18 months, over $60,000 had been transferred to a consulting firm registered under a P.O. box in a neighboring town. Darlene traced the LLC back to Pamela's cousin. That alone was enough to raise eyebrows. But what came next blew the whole thing wide open. One evening, I was reviewing neighborhood security footage with my neighbor Sam, a former network technician who'd set up a shared cloud account for several residents after a string of mailbox thefts. He flipped through timestamps from the night Pamela and her accomplice had trespassed on my property. There, he said, freezing a frame. Look at the time, 2:15 a.m. They weren't just poking around, they were planting something. I leaned in. Pamela's associate knelt at the base of my wall and placed a small black object behind the irrigation valve. The next morning, I returned to the exact spot, pulled back the gravel, and found a waterproof magnetic box. Inside was a piece of crumpled paper with a faint chemical odor. I wore gloves and slid it into a bag. The local precinct's property crimes unit took one look at the footage and brought in a hazmat team. The paper tested positive for residue from a chemical accelerant, something used in arson cases. It didn't take long for them to put 2 and 2 together. 2 days later, Pamela was arrested. She didn't go quietly. Officers showed up during one of her community beautification walks and escorted her into the back of a cruiser while a few stunned residents watched from their porches. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. The entire neighborhood saw the footage at the emergency HOA meeting held the next evening. Gerald tried to distance himself. I had no knowledge of Pamela's actions, he said, pacing in front of the projector screen. She acted independently. You signed the payment authorizations to her cousin's company, I said, standing up. You approved every check. Either you're complicit or you're incompetent. Which is it? He didn't answer. A woman from the back Rhonda, who'd lived in the neighborhood for over 20 years, stood with a folder in her hands. I used to work in accounts receivable, she said. I ran the numbers. That consulting firm billed us for website maintenance, software development, and legal fees. But our website hasn't been updated in over a year. We have no legal retainer on file. And get this, the same invoice appears 3 separate times with different totals. The room erupted. Gerald resigned 3 days later. 2 other board members followed him out. That left only one Dana, the treasurer, who called me the night after the emergency meeting. I didn't know about the contracts, she said quietly. I just signed what Gerald put in front of me. I'm sorry. You need to testify, I said. At the election forum, there was a long pause. Then she said, I will. With the election date approaching, I worked with a group of neighbors to form a temporary oversight committee. We didn't have authority yet, but we used the time to educate residents, showing them exactly where their dues had been wasted. We found invoices for catered lunches that cost over $800 a pop. One expense report listed executive transportation, which turned out to be a local limo service used during a planning retreat that took place at a golf resort 2 counties over. The more we uncovered, the more people joined the cause. Meanwhile, Pamela's case was moving fast. The DA charged her with criminal trespass, attempted property damage, and conspiracy to commit arson. Her lawyer argued it was a misunderstanding, but the footage was damning. The chemical residue was worse. She was released on bond and ordered to stay at least 100 feet from my property. I installed a wrought iron gate in front of my driveway the next day, more for symbolism than necessity. The wall had become more than just a barrier. It was a monument to what happens when good people stop letting bullies run the show. Election day arrived with more turnout than anyone expected. Neighbors who'd skipped HOA meetings for years came in early, some with coffee in hand, others with lawn chairs and umbrellas. People lined up outside the community center an hour before the polls opened. I ran for board president. Darlene ran for treasurer. Sam ran for secretary. Rhonda joined the slate as operations lead. We called ourselves the Clean House Team, and we posted our platform on every bulletin board in the neighborhood: transparency, accountability, no more secrecy. When the final count came in, we won unanimously. Not a single vote was cast for any of the remaining board members. Dana stepped down quietly after submitting a full written statement to the county auditor's office, confirming everything we'd suspected. The first thing we did as a new board was freeze all discretionary spending. The second was open a full audit of the past 5 years. What we found made Pamela's cousins' consulting look like a drop in the bucket. A landscaping company had been billing the HOA twice a month for services they never performed. Over 30 grand in payments and not one documented service call. They were real, but the invoices were fake. The company owner, a former coworker of Gerald's from a downtown property management firm, we compiled everything and handed it off to the county investigator. No press releases. No grandstanding. Just cold, hard facts. Within a month, a grand jury indicted Gerald and 2 others for misappropriation of community funds and falsifying financial records. The HOA's insurance policy kicked in to cover some of the losses, but we still had a long road ahead. Still, something had changed. I walked the block one evening just as the sun dipped behind the mountains. Lawns were green. Kids played basketball in the cul-de-sac. A few neighbors waved from porches, and for the first time in years, it didn't feel like a battlefield. It felt like a neighborhood again, and the wall, still standing, still legal, still casting a long, quiet shadow over the edge of my yard. But now it wasn't just about privacy. It was a reminder you don't win by yelling louder. You win by outsmarting them, by documenting everything. By standing your ground with facts, not fists. And by making sure the next Pamela thinks twice before trying to climb over what she doesn't understand. The new board wasted no time getting to work. Within the first week, we converted the HOA's monthly meetings into open forums, held in the community center with full audio recordings uploaded online. I had a rotating roster of volunteers take minutes, and we passed a motion that required all future contracts to be reviewed by at least 3 non-board homeowners before approval. We weren't just cleaning house, we were bleaching the whole place down to the studs. But beneath the surface, something darker was unraveling. 2 weeks into our term, Darlene walked into my garage with a manila envelope, her lips pressed tight. She didn't speak right away, just set the envelope on my workbench next to a half-assembled planter and nodded for me to open it. Inside were copies of invoices, not the ones we'd already uncovered. These were older, dating back almost 4 years. They were labeled Community Security Contract Tier 3 Emergency Services, authorized by a signature that didn't match any of the previous board's known handwriting. But the payments had cleared, monthly, for just over 2 years. I looked up. "Where'd you find this?" Darlene leaned against the bench. "Buried under inactive accounts in the HOA's archived bank statements. It wasn't filed in the main ledger." Took me 2 hours to cross-reference addresses. The vendor listed was a company called Zayden Protective Services. Sounded official. Looked legit. But when Sam ran a background check using a friend of his who worked in corporate compliance, the business turned out to be a shell. Registered to a mailbox inside an abandoned strip mall halfway across the county. And the name tied to the registration, Albert V., Tressler Pamela's ex-husband. A name she hadn't used in any of her HOA documents. That discovery gave us probable cause to dig deeper. We submitted a formal request to the county's HOA oversight office and brought in a forensic accountant. What she found made everything else look like amateur hour. Over a span of 31 months, the HOA had funneled nearly $120,000 to Zayden for risk mitigation, after-hours patrol, and emergency response coordination. But there was no evidence of any patrols, no logs, no incident reports, no security staff, nothing. It had all been a front. The funds had been siphoned into 3 separate accounts, then quietly withdrawn in cash increments. That alone was bad enough, but then we discovered what Pamela had really been using the money for. The forensic accountant traced a handful of ATM withdrawals to a location regularly visited by Pamela, a secluded rental property just outside city limits. Sam and I drove out there one morning, documenting the route and taking photos from the public road. The house was run down, windows blacked out, cameras mounted at every corner. No signage, no mailbox. But what caught my attention was the row of rusted yard signs leaning against a shed out back, all bearing the HOA's name and logo. We turned everything over to the county investigator handling Pamela's case. 2 days later, law enforcement executed a search warrant. What they found inside that property made headlines. Inside the house were boxes of shredded documents, hard drives, and a dozen counterfeit HOA violation notices. There were even fake compliance warning envelopes, pre-stamped and dated, addressed to homeowners who had supposedly received fines, including several who had never once been late on dues or cited by the board. But the most damning piece was a digital ledger stored on an encrypted laptop. When investigators cracked it, they found a list of every homeowner in the community color-coded by cooperation status, with notes on who had challenged fees, who had spoken at meetings, and who was to be neutralized. The term gave the DA chills. Suddenly, Pamela's late-night wall inspection wasn't just overreach, it was part of a calculated campaign to intimidate and suppress residents who pushed back. Her cousin's consulting firm, a laundering vehicle, Gerald's landscaping buddy, another participant in the scheme. The whole board had been covering for each other, maintaining a system of fear and financial exploitation. The state attorney's office launched a formal investigation into the HOA's prior administration and issued subpoenas to multiple individuals. Gerald was arrested at his office. Pamela's cousin fled but was tracked down in Nevada. The entire scandal was picked up by a local investigative news outlet, and within a week, the neighborhood became a case study in systemic corruption in community associations. At a community meeting held the day after the arrests, I stood at the front of the room, holding a thick binder of evidence we'd compiled over the past month. The room was packed not just with residents, but with attorneys, journalists, and even a state representative who had taken an interest in the case. "We were lied to," I said, scanning the crowd. "Not just about fees and fines, but about what our community stood for. This wasn't mismanagement. It was organized fraud, and it ends now." A woman near the back raised her hand. "What happens to the people who already paid those fake fines?" "We're working on restitution," I said. "The county's asset recovery team is reclaiming what they can. Our new treasurer is establishing a relief fund. And we've submitted a proposal to eliminate HOA dues for the next 6 months while we rebuild." That announcement drew scattered applause, but it wasn't celebration. It was relief. Later that evening, I sat on my deck, watching the sun dip low across the western ridge. The wall stood silent and solid behind me, its concrete face catching the golden light. It no longer felt like a shield. It felt like the line between what we'd lived through and the future we were building. Darlene joined me, 2 glasses in hand, setting one down beside me. "Never thought I'd see the day," she said, settling into the chair beside mine. "You realize we've done more in 6 weeks than the last board did in 6 years. "Because we weren't protecting power," I said. "We were protecting each other." She nodded. "Still." "You think it's over?" "Not for the investigators," I said, "but for us." "Yeah, it's over." Darlene clinked her glass against mine. To the wall," I echoed. "And everything it stood up to." In the months that followed, the HOA bylaws were rewritten from the ground up, with input from every homeowner willing to participate. Fines were capped. Privacy rights were codified. And a new clause was added that required any enforcement action to be accompanied by a third-party review. No more late-night inspections. No more secret lists. The wall stayed. Not because I needed it anymore, but because it had earned its place. It became a symbol in our neighborhood not of defiance, but of resilience. Of what happened when people stopped tolerating corruption, stopped waiting for someone else to fix things. Pamela and her co-conspirators were eventually convicted. Restitution was ordered. Community trust took longer to rebuild, but step by step, it happened. And in the end, what started with a stolen hedge and a concrete wall became the catalyst for something far stronger. A neighborhood that finally remembered who it belonged to, the people who lived in it.